Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Hudson, editor of Architecture Minnesota Magazine, the magazine of the American Institute of Architects Minnesota. AI Minnesota is the host of this webinar. I'll be your moderator for today's session. Thank you for joining us for today's Future of Design series session, REWORK, Arts and Cultural Spaces Designed for COVID-19 Safety. This is the second of a series of webinars AI Minnesota has organized on the future of design of the built environment. Upcoming sessions being held over the next 2 weeks will focus on healthcare facilities, higher education spaces, research laboratories, and we're working on a program related to transportation. You can register for any of these sessions on the AIA Minnesota website. One more note before we introduce our 4 presenters. We're very grateful for the partnership of 2 professional associations who made this session possible. Our many thanks to the Minnesota Association of Museums, which strengthens Minnesota through service to its museum community, and to the Minnesota Theater Alliance, which connects, supports, and advocates for the statewide performing arts community. A couple of housekeeping items. We're recording this session and we will post it to our website soon after its conclusion. Also, we encourage you to type in your questions as you have them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The slide shows you where that is. My colleagues Ann Mayhew and Sherry Hansen at AI Minnesota will be keeping the technology going and helping with the Q&A segment after the 3rd and final presentation today. With that, let's get started. We've gathered an amazing group of speakers today to share their perspectives on how museums, theaters, concert halls, and historic spaces, facilities designed to bring people together to celebrate culture, will need to adapt to be safe and engaging for the public in the context of COVID-19. They've all been working in their own spheres to identify and address near-term risks and to bring forward concerns and questions to keep in mind for the longer term. I think you can now see all the folks you'll be hearing from today. Our sincere thanks to each of you for making time for this. Joining us from the architecture community are John Cook, Senior Project Architect at HGA, and Joan Soranno, FAIA, Design Principal at HGA. John and Joan will be presenting together. And from the arts and culture community, we're joined by Dan Hartman, Director of Glensheen, and Jamie Grant, President and CEO of the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Joan and John from HGA will get us started. We'll have their presentation up on screen in just a moment. While that's happening, a quick note to all of our panelists that I'll give you a brief cue if you're running close to the end of your allotted time. Let's see if we can get that. I think we're sharing now. With that, take it away, Joan and John. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Hopefully everybody can hear us and see our presentation. So today, John and I are going to focus on museums in this time of COVID, and more specifically on some conversations we've recently had with the Walker Art Center and the Minneapolis Institute of Art regarding their plans to reopen. Next. If we back up just a minute, there's a great website by Colleen Dillon Schneider called Know Your Own Bone that focuses on market research for cultural organizations. You can advance it one more slide. Thanks. In early May, she asked people which cultural entities will they return to after reopening. You can see at the top of the list is anything connected to the outdoors like parks, zoos, and beaches. These are places people will feel most comfortable revisiting. At the bottom are places like theaters where they feel less comfortable because of the confined space. Interestingly enough, art and history museums are kind of in the middle and in the green area. And that means that there will be a higher demand to visit a museum when it reopens than before COVID. Next. Another interesting survey from Colleen asked people what would make them feel safe and comfortable again going to a museum, theater, or concert. At the top of the list are many things that are beyond the control of any cultural institution, like a vaccine and lifting government restrictions. But also high on this list are things like mandatory face masks, ability to be outside, and the availability of hand sanitizers. Next. The American Alliance of Museums, which is a nonprofit association with over 4,000 institutional members, has developed a very common sense list of considerations for reopening, like developing a phased timeline and prioritizing health and safety protocols like face masks, physical distancing, and touch-free environments. AAM also talks about cleaning protocols and restricting what they call contact, capacity, and access. So this means things like encouraging online and timed ticketing, limited or no capacity for spaces like cafes, theaters, or high traffic areas, canceling most group events, one-way circulation, and optimizing outdoor use. Next. If we look at how an institution like the Minneapolis Institute of Art is planning for their reopening, they've started with an analysis of how much of the space will be open to the public and what's the capacity for each of these spaces. One thing to note, MIA has generated all of this work in-house, and they've graciously agreed to share it with you today. Next. If MIA is going to limit the number of people coming into the museum, they also need to understand the busiest days of the week, so they can possibly extend the hours of those days to let more people inside. The middle diagram is what's called a heat map, and this is really just a simple diagram to understand where people hang out in the museum, so MIA can respond to bottlenecks and crowded areas. And if time ticketing becomes a reality, they also need to understand how long a visitor typically visits a museum. This is typically called dwell time, so they know how to space out the visitor arrivals. Next. A big part of the reopening planning for museums, and frankly any building at this point, is trying to figure out how people actually move through spaces. So for art museums, the decision to initiate one-way circulation, I think, will have a lot to do with the number of visitors, the size of the museum, and the configuration of galleries. Here you can see Mia's looking at the gallery plan in relationship to specific exhibits. Next. Another interesting part of MIA's reopening process is what's called end-to-end planning. And this is basically making sure the entire visitor experience is considered and choreographed from start to finish. So it's thinking about the visitor's pre-visit experience, like getting a ticket online and arriving to the museum. It's the visit itself, thinking about entry logistics, exploring the exhibits, participating in events and programming. And it's also about when a visitor leaves the museum, thinking about exiting, any kind of takeaways, and transportation. Next. We now want to talk a little bit about the Walker Art Center, a legacy client for HGA since 1986. In 2017, John and I completed an entry expansion across from the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden that you can see here. And in 2005, John was the executive architect for the Herzog and Demeron addition. As most of you probably know, the Walker isn't just a museum, it's an arts complex. And it includes a 400-seat theater, a 250-seat cinema, lots of galleries, classrooms, retail, and a restaurant. So it's a pretty complex building, and we're thinking about ways we can help them with reopening. Next. And again, no decisions have been made at the Walker at this time. But one of the things we're thinking about is, next, please. Yeah, thank you. As visitors arrive to the Walker, one way to reinforce, can you go back one more? Mm-hmm. Thank you. As visitors arrive to the Walker, one way to reinforce physical distancing would be to separate visitors coming in and out of the museum, both from the main entry along Vineland, which is to the right of this plan, and the parking ramp to the south, which is on the right hand. Oops, the entry is on the left, the parking ramp is on the right. Next. The nice thing about the vestibule we designed is there's actually two sets of entry doors about 6 feet apart. So it would be fairly easy with signage to separate traffic coming in and out of the museum. Next. On the parking ramp side, because of the wear and tear in this ramp, in 2017, we installed 2 pairs of sliding glass doors, which in this time of COVID is really the perfect hands-free solution for entry doors. Next. Museums are tangible, immersive experiences that are primarily social spaces. If you think about it, few people visit museums alone. So this idea of physical distancing is really antithetical to these community-oriented places. Next. I know a lot of museums are wrestling with how do you create an inviting, welcoming environment when the first person that greets you has an N95 mask on and plexiglass separating the two of you. Some institutions have talked about branded or artist-designed masks to project a friendlier presence. Next. The most challenging spaces in the museum are places where people gather, like the lobbies. A lot of museums are considering floor decals, directing people where to stand, like in front of a ticketing desk. They're also talking about temporarily closing any space where physical distancing could be a challenge, like a retail shop with tables too close together. And they're also thinking about removing furniture to discourage people from lingering in one place too long. Next. I think over time, as furnishings are gradually reintroduced into common spaces, many museums will also be reupholstering their chairs and sofas with textiles that are more hygienic than fabric. One category of textiles that are particularly effective are called durable coated fabrics, and this is like silicone that are inherently antibacterial. Next. When we think about protocols around physical distancing, does an institution take a more prescriptive approach, like floor decals on the floor, like you see here in a Paris metro station, or do you empower people to be more self-motivated in their safety? Next. For as long as art museums have been around, most people understand that if they get too close to the art, alarms will sound. Question now becomes, how easy will it be for visitors in this time of COVID to keep their distance from each other? I know that most museums will probably be installing timed ticketing system with the possibility of gallery attendants regulating the number of people in each room. But how do we determine the ideal capacity in each gallery? Next. One of the tools that we're starting to build for the walker are these series of interactive plans that quantify not only the square footage of things like public versus private space, but also the capacity of individual rooms like galleries, lobby, and offices. And this is a live document that is infinitely tweakable, so you can analyze very quickly various capacity scenarios and phased reopenings. Next.
So the question is, how do you actually go about calculating capacity given a specific gallery size and configuration based on the proposed exhibition? And there are a lot of different ways to calculate it, but for galleries, you really have to go about it in a more nuanced way. You've heard state guidelines for some businesses and companies using a percentage to calculate capacity, like 25 or 50% of what might be considered typical. An advantage to note about the walkers is that their galleries are nicely sized with high volumes, big open spaces. So the perception is that they're generally easy spaces for people to move around in. Artists and curators usually like the artwork to have enough room around it to be able to view it from different perspectives, like both up close and far away. Unlike some museums that are like, well, for example, going through your grandparents' attic, smaller, more confined rooms where the walkways are narrow and the space is cluttered with objects and artifacts, leaving little room for separation from others. So the image on the left, in the case of a typical 3,500 square foot gallery at the Walker, if you pack people in at the recommended 6-foot grid, you can imagine how uncomfortable you might feel here. Now, it's not quite like the Sistine Chapel experience, but given the guidelines for distancing, you can't move unless someone else near you moves. And well, gallery circulation was never intended to work like this. Oddly enough, the code allowed capacity for a gallery is 30 square feet per occupant, or in this case, about 115 people. So if you were to just simply say, let's take 25 or even 50% of that capacity, you can see that you wouldn't meet either the basic requirement for separation or the desire to have a comfortable gallery experience. So in making a recommendation, you want to make sure to err on the side of conservative spacing. The diagram on the right suggests 200 square feet per occupant, allowing people some freedom to move in a more enjoyable and relaxed setting. Managing the diagram on the right, whether it's 18 or 25 people, will still likely require some self-regulated distancing by the visitors, combined with museum guards limiting maximum occupancy based on the visitors' dwell time in the room. Next, please. Several museums, and as you know, other high capacity building types, are talking about or instituting one-way traffic through a building. And the walker is yet to decide whether or not they'll instigate this protocol. Typically in art museums, curators don't like the requirement for people to move through the gallery in a forced march or by one-way circulation, because it doesn't allow for the visitor to experience what you might call a serendipitous moment with the art. You always feel the pressure to keep moving, leaving not much time to pause and reflect. But if the walker were to consider one-way circulation, the Barnes galleries are somewhat ideally suited for that. Since the galleries pinwheel up and around a central circulation core, one could easily see a simple path spiraling up through the galleries, but careful planning would have to be put into how the stairs and elevators within the central core are managed for flow and occupancy, as these are more confined spaces with two-way travel. Next. A lot of museums are looking at a phased approach to opening, starting with the galleries and maybe a limited number of galleries at that, and then slowly ramping up occupancy over time to include spaces like theaters and restaurants. These are the more confined spaces in the building with still the tightest restrictions. And in the case of theaters with fixed seating, as you saw in an earlier graph that Joan shared, people just aren't quite ready to venture out for a movie or theater experience yet. But the walker needs to start planning for when they reopen these spaces to the public. So again, how do you calculate the safe capacity with appropriate physical distancing for spaces like this? Next. The Walker Theater is a very unique one in that its full capacity is only about 412 people with fixed seating on the main floor and loose seating on the two upper balconies. But it has all of the back of house support of a big theater with a large proscenium opening and fly loft. They can do a big show in a very intimate setting. Next. And then again, if you analyze capacity, there are two ways of doing it in the fixed seating area. One is to simply look at singles occupying the assigned seats, with each person maintaining at least 6 feet of separation from another. Or in the second and more likely scenario on the right, looking at family members in the range of 2 to whatever size sitting together. But then you've got this overlay of sophisticated technology to calculate the maximum capacity of the remaining seats based on group size and physical distancing constraints. Again, we're just at the beginning of analyzing the possibilities for them. Next.
A big part of the entry experience in 2017 was designing a full-service restaurant called Esker Grove. Like many restaurants around town, Esker Grove might consider a phased approach to reopening, where they open their outdoor dining terrace first, which you can see on the left, and indoor dining at a later time. Next. And finally, to wrap up, it's such a strange time for art museums right now, because if you think about it, what's really needed to respond to this pandemic is professionalism, efficiency, insurance, and most importantly, safety. Art, on the other hand, is all about eccentricity, risk, resistance, and adaptation. How these two forces come together will be really interesting to see over the next couple months. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan and John. Seeing some of those images, I'm reminded that the Walker in particular has some good fortune in having such a large landscape around it for outdoor gatherings and those wide stairs in the Barnes buildings, but so many challenges remain. Next up is Glensheen's Dan Hartman. Dan will have your presentation up on screen here, and take it away whenever you're ready.
Sounds good. So this is Dan Hartman. I'm the director of the Glensheen Mansion in Duluth. So feel free to go to the next slide if you want. So I guess I'm going to really kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of what we're trying to do. And I first want to say that this is a draft plan. We are working with our university colleagues to make sure we're being as safe as we possibly can, with also following other university regulations. So I will say once again, this is a draft plan, and so you're one of the first public audiences to see what we're trying to do. So with that being said, if you want to go to the next slide. We are looking at a lot of considerations and advice from the CDC, the state of Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, but actually was brought up earlier. We're looking at a lot from the American Alliance of Museums, who I think is giving really good advice on things to think about going forward. In particular, I think that one-way traffic is something that a lot of museums have not really begun to think about, and when they do, it changes a lot of the logistics for your museum setup. It may be easy for some, but I will say we've been working at it now for about 3 weeks to a month, and there are some significant changes we're making because of that, which I will get into later. You want to go into the next slide? So before I go into this, I just want to say, hearing that first presentation made me realize I should talk about a couple other things. So before I get into this, we are also doing the phased approach. So what we're hoping to launch here in the next couple weeks is phase 1, where we will open just the grounds of Glensheen. And so that way people can experience our gardens, which frankly are already looking great as of even today. And so it'd be kind of fun for the visitors to come and experience this again. We are also working on something else to launch at that same time that I'm kind of excited about, but I won't announce officially today yet. But either way, I think we're hoping to open the grounds and have people back at Glensheen here in the coming weeks. And that's phase 1. Phase 2 is where we would actually open the mansion and we would provide self-guided tours. So one of the other really big recommendations is, and that'll be the big change, is no guided tours. And I'll get into that later too. But otherwise, you know, in regards to staff protection, we are spending a lot of time trying to make sure that when my staff comes back, they feel like they're safe being in this environment. I don't think we're going to have the traffic numbers that we've had in the past, but we're still going to see, you know, more than a few hundred people a day. And, you know, I think all of us are a little concerned about that from a safety perspective. And so we're doing a lot of things to make that better. So if you want to go to the next slide. So first is we've actually purchased from Target all of these no-touch thermometers. And so staff at any point, if they feel like they have a fever and want to check themselves, they can. We are asking that any staff who feels like they're sick or has symptoms to choose immediately go home. We're not having a waiting area. We are asking them just to leave and go home, and we will figure that out later. Safety is number 1. So you want to go to the next slide? We have also purchased a lot of masks. This is not an N95, but we have, you know, a varying degree, and we don't have N95s. The university and the CDC has recommended that we still save those for medical workers at this time. If that changes, we will then probably buy those in mass as well. We do have thousands of disposables as well, and those are for our staff and our guests if they deem it. We are working with our Office of General Counsel right now to see whether we can make it a requirement that all museum visitors wear a mask. And so that's something to be seen. Next slide. This is one of the things we probably spent a decent amount of money on, is we, in our gift shop, our ticketing center, and also on several of our stations throughout the mansion, we are creating these actual acrylic barriers. And even behind the acrylic barrier, our staff will all be asked to wear masks at all times. But we wanted to have some type of physical barrier there. And in the ticket operation, there will be 2 separate workstations. And both stations will have these acrylic barriers, but when there's a shift change, one will have a clean station and the other one will be a used station. So that when the shift change happens, they just go directly to the other station. And so it'll look weird to the visitor. There'll be 2 counters and there won't be 2 people helping you. Only one person will help you at a time. But we really felt it was important to have 2 stations, one that was clean and the one that's in use. And then when that one's done, then that person would clean their station before their next shift. And so that'll be true in the gift shop, ticket house, and other spaces as well. You want to go to the next slide? So these are the big changes that I think are going to surprise people when they come to visit Glensheen, hopefully this summer, and what we have grappled with. So if you want to go to the next slide. First one, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is no guided tours. We are a historic house museum that has a 40-year-plus history of guided tours at Glensheen. And this will be the first summer in its history where we don't have guided tours. So we are shifting all of our tour guides to different roles, hoping to try to give them some employment this summer too. And these are all almost entirely students of the University of Minnesota Duluth. So we kind of feel for them right now. And so that self-guided experience will be for everything. So right now, and you see the woman in this position right now on the 3rd floor, our 3rd floor and attic tour, which was always a guided tour, will now be a self-guided tour experience this summer. So we have spent a lot of time making that a reality, which means making an audio tour on the app, making new text narrative in every single room of the 3rd floor and attic tour, and also creating that into our new online Glensheen app as well, which has been, as you would imagine, a decent amount of work in a short period of time. But I do think it'll still have that great Glensheen experience that people are looking for, just in a different format. If you want to go to the next slide. So the other really significant change that I'm not the most thrilled about, but is I think what we got to do is the one-way traffic. So we have installed throughout the entire mansion, all floors, stanchions guiding people in one-way traffic. It does look a little bit like stanchion land in areas, but I think this will help gear people to get in that one-way traffic. And I do agree with the point that was made earlier that unfortunately people won't have those whimsical moments where they can sit and stare at the art. But I think for safety, we've agreed to move down this path. And I think for the lion's share of our visitors, they are a little quicker than they typically are in art museums too. So I think we have that going for us. So I'd say be mindful of your museum type. But there is going to be that sense of people who like to spend 2 hours here and then others who like to spend 15 minutes. And there's going to be a little bit of a skipping, shall we say, of people at times, which I think is not great, but I don't think it's going to be unavoidable. But like I said, basement to attic, there are stanchions on every floor now guiding people in one-way traffic. I wish I would have made a little pretty slide of the arrows going through. I even have the photo. But that will be happening soon. Next slide. So this is another big thing is now every day, some of our staff will be part of the cleaning team. So we will still have chairs on the grounds. We still will have chairs inside the house. We just feel it's important for people of need to have that to take a seat. And in order to make sure that those spaces are clean, we really need a group who is just constantly going through the estate, cleaning and disinfecting all of our different areas with gloves, with disinfectant, probably even with a face mask and maybe even a shield as they go around. And so if you were to come visit Glensheen, you will see them walking around the estate all day. And this is going to be an 8-hour shift for this team. This is not a come in the morning and leave. This is an all-day event. So that is part of our plan. Next slide. And so I don't know why I took a picture of this, but just an idea of the disinfectant. So these chairs are not our normal chairs that we have out. We have taken out all of our original seated chairs because there was no easy way to clean them. And so now they've been replaced by private event chairs that frankly are not as comfortable, but they are much better to clean and disinfect. Next slide. Next slide. I think you get the picture. We have also now installed these stations on every floor of the mansion, and then 2 in our carriage house, just places for people to find hand sanitizer. We actually are not using Purell. We are actually utilizing sanitizer from our local cocktail shop, Vickery here in Duluth. I think it's a great way to support local. We've bought gallons and gallons of the stuff. But this is just a way for self-care of our visitors and our staff as they're around. There also will be tissues too. Yeah, next slide. And like I said before, we will be offering disposable masks to our guests. So we've ordered a pretty good amount of that as well. Next slide. So I just wanted, I think there's a lot of conversation about what we're doing from a safety perspective, but sometimes I think it's okay to try to think of the silver linings that are happening with COVID right now. And we definitely have a lot of, kind of horrible things going on, but this is one of the positives. Next slide. So my historic housekeeping team, for them, this is kind of like a dream come true. They have no visitors and they get to be in the house for longer hours and clean all the things that they've dreamed of having the time to clean. And so the silver in Glensheen will have never looked this good. The brass will have never looked this good. There are pieces in the house that we have never polished in 40 plus years, and probably the condos didn't polish for a number of years. And we are going to levels of detail we have not done before. Next slide. So this is one polished, for example, plated silver. Next slide. This is a doorknob in the infirmary of the 3rd floor, which I will tell you has not looked this good. And it has allowed my staff to take the bamboo sticks out and to really get all the polish out from the past years. As you can tell, they're taking the hardware off all the way down to get even behind the pieces. My gardener is even going to a greater extent of things on the grounds right now. So next slide, please.
And Dan, just a reminder, we're getting close to the end of your allotted time.
Yep, and I think this is my last slide. And so last thing on that note is we've actually even taken the rugs out on the attic, which we've never had the time for before, and we rolled them out for a short period so people can actually see the original historic rugs of Glensheen, which used to cover every floor of the mansion. So there's my allotted time, and hopefully you guys can kind of get a gist of what we're hoping to do here, but pretty significant. Oh, I forgot to tell you the big changes. We are moving our entire ticketing operation from the ticket house to the carriage house. Our gift shop is actually moving to the basement of the mansion. So that way that forced one-way traffic has to go through it at the same time as well. Sorry, completely forgot that. Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Dan. You can hear the excitement in your voice. I know you want people back, and it looks like you guys are doing some great work to make that happen, focusing on some of the positives too.
Thank you.
Yeah, our final speaker is the Ordway's Jamie Grant, CEO and President of the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Jamie, we're gonna switch to video for you. If you end up wanting to share your screen partway through, please do so whenever you like, but take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This could be a very short presentation if you work in the performing arts, because the first response is, this doesn't work for us. Having said that, I think it's important to sort of set up what's happened in a very short period of time that brings us to today, and the number of issues that we're taking a look at as we imagine the Performing Arts Center of the future. On March the 2nd, which just seems like a few days ago, I was on vacation, and I called into the office, as I do when I'm on vacation, to sort of see how things are going. And my colleague said, I think we should have a conversation about this coronavirus thing. And we agreed that we would have a meeting. I was on the West Coast, and so I had a 7 a.m. meeting on March the 3rd to talk about COVID-19. One of our VPs was having shoulder surgery, and his doctor wouldn't allow him to come into the office, and we immediately made him the COVID-19 expert of the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. And every bit of information that we collected and gleaned during that period of time got sent to him. And we really went out and tried to take a look at what would this mean? What could this mean? What might this mean? On March the 12th, we had a show scheduled to open on Broadway, which was the first time ever that a show had gone from the Ordway Center directly to Broadway, and it was going to open on March the 12th, and Governor Cuomo shut down Broadway on March the 12th. And on March the 13th, our governor here in Minnesota shut down large public gathering spaces with this declaration of a state of emergency. And we felt that we had done our homework and that we had prepared for what was to come. My last day in the office was on March 16th. So if you hear the dog barking, that's what my new office is like. And what this meant for us is that all performances happening at the Ordway from then on were canceled, including a 2-week run of The Last Ship, which is a musical that was written and starring Sting. Yes, that Sting. My wife was so proud of me for 2 years, and I had to come home and tell her that Sting wasn't coming because COVID-19 was here. On March 31st, we had to lay off 90% of our workforce, and we have been trying to develop strategies and plans to imagine a future in this scenario that makes sense going forward. How could we have a theater that would operate both upstage of the footlights and in the audience that would make social distancing work? We had a number of great cleaning protocols that we were able to enhance and change. And of course, we got appropriate equipment into the theater for our staff. To this day, the theater is not in operation, but our safety and security people and our housekeeping people and engineers are trying to keep the building alive. A big building like ours that is used to operating with lots of people needs to keep going. And a building that is largely made of mahogany and brass requires certain climate considerations. And we have 5 or 6 grand pianos in the institution that have to be taken care of. And I've learned that we spent tons of money on vegetable oil to keep all the pipes working during this time. When we took a look at the whole idea of social distancing making sense, our large theater is north of 1,900 seats. And depending on how many family units come, it really turns into 270 seats in a 1,900 seat theater. Think about it, our favorite seats in the house, the aisle seats, can't exist anymore because of course people need to use those, our ushers need to use those, and our patrons need to use those aisles as they come in to sit down. When we imagine the use of our intermissions, how long does it actually take to access the restroom for our audiences, and what intermission time is necessary to make it work? And as you start to imagine that and develop scenarios around this way of performing, we quickly realize that the economics of the current programmings that exist do not make sense in terms of social distancing. A 270 seat theater for a show that's traditionally budgeted to sell 1,900 seats simply doesn't work for us going forward. So ultimately, our existing programming and social distancing cannot fit together. Now, having said that, we can develop specific programs for social distancing. We can develop content that can take place online. This week, we are running the Flint Hills Family Festival, the 20th edition of this festival, and it's all happening virtually, and people can participate online and have an experience. It's a different experience than it is every other year, but can still have an experience. And we've discovered that those scenarios are important. If you think about social distancing from a backstage perspective, which is another area that we're greatly concerned about, we're very worried about how that works. Think about the last play or opera that you saw where the characters could be 6 feet apart. And our artistic director and I sort of challenged each other to find even one play that could work that way, and I think we only found one. So as we imagine that side of it, that becomes a great challenge to imagine, how do you do a love scene from 6 feet apart? How does the program exist in the way that it should going forward? Now, there is some good news, but it's scary as you imagine. Our colleagues at a theater in Seoul, South Korea have not stopped at all. COVID-19 has slowed things down, but they are currently running a production of Phantom of the Opera, the Andrew Lloyd Webber piece in Seoul, and they have managed to get the audiences into the theater in a systematic way and use every seat. But it involves the audience's willingness to wear a mask, willingness to sanitize their hands before coming in, willingness to have their temperature taken, willingness to use hands-free in every part of the equation. And their tickets are online. There's no house programs anymore. And they have managed to do it. On the backstage side of it, they have had the Phantom of the Opera company become a family, for lack of a better word. There's nobody in or out in relationship to the family. There are regular tests on a weekly basis rotating for each cast member and crew member, and there's no one else that's allowed in the family. They shelter in place, if you like, at the theater and in the hotel. And if you try to imagine companies touring the country in that environment, it really fundamentally changes how we do work for everything. Right now, when a big show comes into the Ordway, we provide local crew for that big show. We often provide local musicians. And it's not impossible to imagine that those tours of the future will travel with their own technicians and their own musicians. If the unions that govern actors and musicians and technicians are able to come up with social distancing protocol that they think makes sense. I was in the Toronto area 17, 18 years ago when Toronto went through SARS. And while SARS was much more deadly, specifically, if you caught it, you were more likely to die, COVID-19 feels like sort of SARS on steroids. It's a much more mammoth undertaking, impacting many more people. We were aware at that time that even once health officials said it was safe to come back to the theater, it took 2 years for audiences to be willing to come back in the numbers that they were in previously. And we have a very long road ahead. If there's a bright light or good news in these opportunities, these large spaces will be able to be used with appropriate social distancing for programs that we haven't yet imagined, for ways of using the space that we haven't thought about yet. And we will be able to create shared experiences and memories that exist between artists and audiences in a brand new way as a result of this exercise. But I can't lie, the journey is really scary, and there's no simple solution that makes sense. And what I've discovered is no one's crystal ball is any better than mine in terms of determining when we can get back to the way things were, and how this fear that this crisis has created will impact us in the years and days ahead. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Jamie. It is a sobering challenge for sure. And we got some questions here. It's not, with the Q&A, we're eager to hear our panelists' thoughts on the questions you all have posted. Sherry's been feeding them to me. We've done our best to identify those that will be of broad interest or that went in particularly interesting directions. So thank you, Sherry. And while we may not be able to get to everyone's questions, we'll do our best with the time we have. Anne's got everyone back on screen here shortly. The first question, I'm going to start with an easy one just to get us started. Joan and John, there was a very simple question as to whether that capacity calculator, whether that tool is broadly available or whether that's proprietary.
I wouldn't say it's proprietary in that there are other, firms and institutions that have the capability of doing it, but it isn't something that's kind of off the shelf. You actually have to build it. So you have to build the plans. You basically have to work out square footages and then run capacity scenarios. So again, all the software is readily available to people, but it doesn't come packaged into one thing. And again, we have a group at HGA called DIG. They're kind of our research arm of the firm, and they're really good at putting together all of this information to help clients imagine these different capacity scenarios, but also, which we haven't gotten, the other piece that we haven't gotten to yet is starting to analyze flow and circulation through the spaces in terms of the walker right now is imagining 3 different time scenarios. So like a lot of organizations, a soft opening and then gradually ramping up. And so with this interactive tool, we can start to calculate not only capacity, but also, again, circulation through the building as more parts of the building are open.
Gotcha, thank you. From a fairly simple, straightforward question to one of the most difficult ones we're asking across building types, and that is, what are some early discussions on how we address or adapt restrooms and elevators and places where we put people into close contact with each other that may be high-touch surfaces? I know there's no perfect answer right now, and there needs to be time to let these solutions evolve, but what are the early conversations about that? And I'll throw that out to Dan. Let's start with Dan.
Thanks. So yeah, this is a difficult question. I'm just going to point out that we are organizing our entire operation through that one-way traffic. And so our hope is that the bathrooms will be kind of included in that line to kind of pace people out when that need arrives. We will still have others out by the parking lot, but really those ones indoors are going to be the sticky point, as alluded by the question. But yeah, even our gift shop is through the one-way traffic now.
Anyone else want to chime in on that, or can I advance?
Chris, I think one of the things that we're looking at for our elevators is the days of an elevator attendant. So somebody who would actually help somebody get on, per se, be the button pusher, and people would go up that way. And I think the day of restroom attendance is coming back to the Performing Arts Center near you, as we need to clean.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of the same topics you've heard. It's cleanliness of the restroom. It's keeping your distance when you're in the restroom. But I think most important, it's coming out with clean hands, because you've gone in and touched some things. But if you can come out with nice clean hands and not operate a door on your way out, I think that's a key ingredient in containing it.
But it's also in restrooms, even the restrooms where you can prop open a door, if there's not a hands-free solution to that, where you can just prop it open. So again, people aren't having to touch the door. That's kind of a makeshift solution to at least the door. So that's another thing that people have been talking about.
Gotcha, thank you. Jamie, you kind of anticipated one of the audience questions when you talked about stage, backstage operations, staff areas, and how difficult that is to manage. A question that piggybacked on that is, Are you thinking about rehearsal spaces too? Are there things or special considerations for rehearsal spaces for performers?
Well, right now, we're waiting for Actors Equity and the Musicians Union to come up with some guidelines that we will follow. This is a very collaborative art form, and we work with everybody to make sure that we're safe. I was on a call this morning with a colleague of mine who runs an orchestra. Think about the woodwind section of how close can players sit together. And whenever I think it's really tough on me, I imagine how it is for her right now. So I think we're working through all of these things, and we're waiting for guidelines, and we're waiting for expert advice. One of the things that I think is really positive about our industry is we're very eager to tell you when we don't know something, and we're happy to go to experts who can help us make the wisest decisions possible. And no one wants to risk a guest, an employee, or an artist getting sick in this time. So yes, I don't know, a number of my colleagues are still working on shows, and they're happening in a format similar to this, where people are rehearsing this way. But at a certain point in time, you have to put a show up on its feet, and that means we all have to be in the same room, and there has to be a scenario that's safe to do that.
Thank you, Jamie. Another question had to do with accessibility and equity. It's going to be hard enough to get people back into these spaces. What are the considerations for making these spaces safe and easier to navigate for people with disabilities, with mobility disabilities, people who are sight impaired, with new kinds of signage that are maybe going in that might not be easily accessible for some? What are some of the early conversations around that for this summer and fall?
Oh, Chris, me? Okay. So, Chris, one thing that's interesting is that I've heard a lot about, again, in articles, is that for a lot of cultural institutions, they've taken a financial hit. So in terms of not so much about accessibility in an ADA perspective, but some institutions talking about prioritizing members coming back first, because again, they're typically, if you do an analysis, they're the ones that financially support the museum. But then the question becomes, how are you being equitable to everyone? And so I know some cultural institutions are talking about special hours for people to come in that, again, for specific times, sort of like supermarkets now, again, are open an hour earlier for, people. I've heard some cultural institutions talking about that, but the equity piece is really important. I know around elevators, some cultural institutions have talked about the elevators just being used for those in need. So you don't have the density. Most people that are able-bodied would take stairs and leave the elevators for people that can use them. So I know there's a lot of conversations around equity, and they're really important ones to have, frankly.
Chris, if I were to add one quick thing, I think one of the things that is scariest about the idea of, particularly for the performing arts in an era of social distancing, is as the number of seats lessen, the access becomes a challenge. And I think that is something that we have to be aware of. If you think how many tickets Hamilton sells when there are 2,000 seats, what's it going to be like when there's 200 seats? That whole equation becomes scary for me. And it's part of the reason that one of the cases that we've made is that the economics of certain pieces don't work from a social distancing perspective, and access would be really curtailed from our point of view.
Dan, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think this is going to continue to be a challenge. I mean, as an historic house museum, you would imagine we have several issues with this in general. Oddly enough, in some ways, this will actually be an opportunity for us to be better. Our third floor and attic tour no longer being guided, for example, makes that more accessible to everybody. We've had a lot of issues on our guided tours in the past, and this will help make that a better experience for more. I will say we'll have probably continued challenges on the grounds. We have some pretty steep areas of the estate. We are already in process of working on that too, but I will say there's some real significant opportunities out there. Someone brought this up as another question, but I think there's a lot of conversation about virtual museums right now, but the other one that really has an opportunity to take off is the pop-up museums, where in these outdoor spaces, people bring their exhibits to another location that may not be on their site. And frankly, that's a lot more accessible than a lot of these museums are normally. And so that might open our educational environments up even more than we were intending to, which I think is a good positive that might come out of this. So just something else to think about as we see crazy response right now to our state parks and other outdoor environments. My guess that's going to continue for a while, and museums will realize that that's where the people are at, and they might start moving into those spheres even outside of the virtual one.
Thank you all. Are there any, I know none of you are engineers, but are there any HVAC considerations that, that you're talking about to making air circulation and ventilation a little safer? It's a complex topic, but are there some things you can share right now?
Well, I am by no means a mechanical engineer, but things that we have talked about internal to HCA in helping some of these museum buildings look at opening is, and I noticed one of the questions was asking about, should you reduce the number of air changes per hour so you're not moving as much air? And actually, what I've learned is it's quite the opposite. You want to increase the number of air changes per hour, increase the filtration on that air. So use HEPA filters that are designed to take out, it's like an N95 mask for your air handler. And then the idea of adding some really intense ultraviolet lighting inside the actual air handler. Now we're talking about big air handlers here for big buildings. But as that air moves across that chamber of that air handling unit, blast it with UV light to, again, help decontaminate it. So those are some of the things that we're looking at in a basic way, but every institution is different and everyone's going to deal with it in a different way.
Of course, art museums, there's an advantage with art museums because there's humidity is good in this case, 40 to 60% relative humidity, and art museums are, they're perfectly conditioned spaces, so they've got that one leg up in that respect, but there's additional things they can do mechanically, absolutely.
All right, well, we're coming up on time. Three quick things as we close out. I first want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. Wish we could do an hour-long session with each of you. Thank you again for carving out time from your busy calendars to be here. Also, a big thank you to our sponsors, the Minnesota Theater Alliance, the Minnesota Association of Museums. It was great to partner with you on this. We hope we can collaborate with you again in the future. And finally, we want to again share the invitation to join us for our upcoming webinars in this Future of Design series. So check out our website. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.